Chapter 9. From Birmingham to Washington. 1963 began badly for the SCLC and Martin Luther King. He had had success in Montgomery and Greensboro, but now, for the first time, he failed. The SCLC tried to end segregation in Albany, Georgia. They fought against the town government and the police for almost a year. But at the end of the year, Albany's schools, libraries, and parks were still segregated. King had lost in Albany. Now he needed to win somewhere. He started to think about Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was one of the worst cities in the country for black people. It was sometimes called Bombingham because there had been so many bomb attacks on houses and churches in black neighborhoods. There had been 18 of these attacks in the last 6 years, but no one was ever arrested for them. The chief of the Birmingham police was a man called Bull Connor. When the SCLC organized protests in Birmingham, Connor's policemen beat the protesters and attacked them with dogs. Hundreds of protesters were hurt, and hundreds were arrested. King was one of the protesters who went to prison. When he was in prison, King read that some white church leaders had called for an end to the protests. They said it was not the right time for protests. King was angry when he read this. He wrote a letter to the white churchmen. In it, he said, "You say it's not the right time to protest. You say wait. For years I've heard the word wait. For too many years, black people have waited. Too often. Wait means never." There was a problem with the protest. When men and women were arrested and put in prison, they often lost their jobs. It was difficult for black families when their fathers and mothers were in prison. "Why not ask young people to join the protest?" King said. Plenty of school children wanted to join the protesters in Birmingham because they wanted to help. Freedom was as important to them as it was to their parents. Some black leaders were worried about this plan. "These young children will get hurt when the police attack," they said. But King's reply was, "Segregation will hurt them even more." On the 2nd of May, 1963, 50 children aged from 6 to 18 marched to the center of Birmingham. They were arrested and put into prison. Then another 50 did the same. They were also arrested and put in prison. Then another 50. Then another. By the end of the day, 1,000 children were in prison. Birmingham's prisons were full. At first, the police were too surprised to do anything. But next day, they came with police dogs and powerful water hoses. Men, women, and children were knocked down by the power of the water and attacked by the dogs. When the protests were shown on television, the violence of the Birmingham police shocked many Americans. Black people were attacked by police just because they wanted the same rights as white people. People all over the country knew that this was not right. They knew that things had to change. And people in other countries were shocked too. How was this possible in a country like the United States of America, the land of the free? People began to ask questions about freedom in America. Was it only for white Americans? What about black Americans? Birmingham agreed to stop segregation in its schools and on its buses. King had won the battle. Later in the year, he had his finest moment. In the summer of 1963, President Kennedy tried to get a new civil rights law. Civil rights leaders organized the biggest protest march of all to support the president. They wanted people from all over the country to go to Washington, D.C., and ask for equal rights for Black Americans. On the 28th of August, 1963, more than 250,000 people came to Washington and marched to the Lincoln Memorial. There were speeches and songs. Finally, Martin Luther King stood up and made the greatest speech of his life. "I have a dream," he said. In the America of his dream, blacks and whites were equal and lived together in peace. The speech was shown on television all over the world. People cried when they heard King's words. Surely things must change now, they thought. The country was full of hope for the future. But later in that year, 1963, America was once again shocked by terrible violence. Chapter 10. This Country is Sick. A month after King's Washington speech, there was more violence, again in Birmingham, Alabama. A bomb was thrown into a black church, and 4 young black girls were killed. King's message did not change, but the bomb made it harder to persuade people that nonviolence was the answer. On the 22nd of November, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, Texas. King had known Kennedy well and worked with him. They had argued about the best way to win equal rights for blacks, but they had agreed that equal rights for all must come soon. Like most Americans, King was shocked by Kennedy's death. "This country is sick," he said. Sometimes he thought about his own death. Perhaps somebody hated King enough to kill him too. He wondered about the new president. Lyndon B. Johnson came from the South. What was his policy on segregation? Did he want to end it, like Kennedy, or to continue with it? Nobody knew the answer yet. After his Washington speech, King became famous all over the world. When people thought of the fight for civil rights in America, they thought of Martin Luther King. In 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his civil rights work. He was only 35 years old, the youngest person, and only the second American ever to win this important prize. At the end of 1964, Time magazine named him Man of the Year. King's work continued. In the South, very few black leaders were elected to government. Before people could vote, they had to register. Very few blacks did this because it was very difficult. In Mississippi, for example, only 7% of blacks were registered to vote. King realized that he had to get blacks to register and then vote. That was the best way to change the segregation laws in the South. Registering black voters was difficult in many states, but Alabama was one of the worst. More than 300,000 blacks in this state wanted to vote, but were not registered. King was asked to help black voters to register in Selma, Alabama. Selma was a small town of 30,000 people. Half of the people in Selma were black, but only 1% of them were registered to vote. If blacks wanted to register to vote, they had to pass a reading test. Almost all failed the test, although they could often read better than the whites who gave them the test. To register, blacks had to go to an office that was only open twice a month. The white people who worked in the office arrived late and left early. When blacks tried to register, they were often told to go away. King and the SCLC planned a protest march from Selma to Montgomery, 50 miles away. Montgomery was the state capital, and it was in this city that the arrest of Rosa Parks has started the battle for civil rights. The march started on the 7th of March. Police met the marchers on the road to Montgomery and told them to go back. When the marchers refused, the police attacked them. They beat the protesters, and one man was killed. Once again, people all over the world were shocked by police violence against peaceful protesters. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the Selma police to protect the marchers. On the 21st of March, the march from Selma to Montgomery started again. It took 5 days, but this time there was no violence. When the march entered Montgomery, there were 25,000 marchers, black and white. The leader of the Alabama government, George Wallace, refused to meet the marchers or listen to their protests. But the message of the marchers reached the government in Washington. Later that year, Martin Luther King was there when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Law of 1964. This law protected the rights of all Americans to vote, and it was one of the most important laws of Martin Luther King's life. It made a big difference to blacks in the South. In 1963, only 6% of blacks in the South were registered to vote. By 1969, 66% were registered. Now no one could stop blacks from voting for their own leaders. Chapter 11. I'm Black and I'm Proud. The 1960s were a time of great change in America. Young people all over America were asking questions about their country. They did not always believe what their parents believed. They wanted change. At the March on Washington, a young singer called Bob Dylan put the thoughts of young Americans into his song, "The Times They Are A-Changin'." "Things are changing fast," the song said. "The old must listen to the young, and they cannot stop change." Young blacks did not want to wait patiently for change. Although they knew that Martin Luther King had worked hard for equal rights, they thought that change was happening too slowly. They wanted power for black people, and they did not want to ask politely for it. Perhaps violence was necessary for change, they thought. In 1966, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton started the Black Panther Party. The Panthers did not agree with Martin Luther King about the use of nonviolence. They said that blacks should buy guns to protect themselves from attacks by whites. Huey Newton said that the Civil Rights Law of 1964 was too little, too late. After a fight between the Panthers and the police, Newton was arrested and put into prison because he killed a white police officer. Crowds of Panther supporters marched through the streets shouting, "Free Huey!" Other Panthers died in battles with the police. Most white Americans were afraid of the Black Panthers. They thought that they were violent criminals. But the Panthers also did some good work. They opened schools in poor black neighborhoods and gave food and clothes to blacks. After a few years, the Black Panther Party broke into smaller groups, but its message reached many young African Americans and made them proud to be black. They started to learn about Africa, eat African food, and wear African clothes. Another person who wanted a different America for blacks was Malcolm X. In the past, Many blacks had the name of their slave owner as their last name, so Malcolm changed his last name from Little to X. For him, it was a way of saying goodbye to slavery. Like the Black Panthers, Malcolm X did not agree with Martin Luther King about the use of violence. Blacks should not ask for help from whites, he thought. Blacks should help themselves. Violence was necessary when you were fighting for your rights. Malcolm said that blacks should fight violence with violence. It was the only language that white racists understood. "If a man speaks the language of violence," said Malcolm, "you can't speak to him in the language of peace. He'll break you in two. If a man speaks French, you can't speak to him in German. You have to find out what this man speaks. Once you know his language, learn how to speak his language. Then we can talk." Many young blacks agreed with Malcolm X more than with Martin Luther King. They were angry that they still did not have the same rights as whites. Poor blacks living in the big cities of the North wanted to vote, but they wanted other things too. They wanted better houses and more jobs. In many of the poorer neighborhoods of America's big cities, young blacks rioted. Many people died in these riots. In the 60s, many important black writers and musicians became famous in America. Writers like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison showed Americans what the lives of black people were like. In his book, The Fire Next Time, Baldwin warned of terrible violence in the future. To stop this, whites must change their ways, he said. The black musician, Stevie Wonder, sang about the difficulties of young blacks. One of his songs told the story of a young boy who was born in the South but moved to Chicago to find work. He finds that in the North he is free, but free only to be poor. Why was anyone surprised that young blacks were angry? Perhaps the most famous black man in the 1960s was the boxer Muhammad Ali. Born Cassius Marcellus Clay in 1942 in Louisville, Kentucky, young Clay won an Olympic gold medal in 1960. He fought the world champion Sonny Liston in 1964, and to the surprise of most people, Clay won. After the fight, he surprised the world when he said that he had become a Muslim and had changed his name to Muhammad Ali. "Don't call me Cassius Clay," he said. "That's a slave name." Ali was loud and proud and clever. "I am the greatest," he said. And he was. No one could beat him. He began to speak out against racism. In 1967, he refused to join the U.S. Army and fight in Vietnam. Because of this, he was put in prison, and he was told that he was not the world champion anymore. When he got out of prison, he beat George Foreman to become world champion again. Ali said, "When I refused to fight in Vietnam, I wasn't a hero. I just wanted to be free. I wanted America to be America." Chapter 12. Black and White, Unite and Fight. The late 1960s were a time of change for Martin Luther King, too. Although he was always against violence, he began to see that there were many different kinds of violence. King was from the South, and he wanted freedom and equal rights for the blacks of the South. But life for blacks in northern cities was not easy either. Blacks in the North could go to the same schools as whites, but many black children did not finish school. Most northern blacks were poor, Many could not find a job when they left school. Many came from one-parent families and lived in buildings that were old and dirty. It seemed to King that poverty was itself a kind of violence. He began to think about the rights that all people should have. It was true that black people had the vote, true that they could eat in the same restaurants as whites. But it is one thing to be able to eat in a restaurant. It is another thing to have the job that gives you the money to eat there. King believed that a few rich people had too much money and millions of poor people had too little. He wanted an end to poverty, and that meant that someone had to take money from the rich and give it to the poor. It was a strong message, and many people who supported King on civil rights were not sure about it. These new ideas seemed dangerous to many of his supporters. King took his marches and protests to the great northern city of Chicago. He wanted to show America how black people lived in the cities of the North. And he saw that it was not just black people in the big cities who were poor. There was poverty among whites, too. King wanted to unite poor black and poor white people, to bring them together to end poverty. "Black and white, unite and fight," he said. He led marches through the streets of Chicago. Just as in the South, the marchers were attacked by the police. Sometimes it was worse than in the South. The marchers were hit with sticks and bottles. Some black leaders did not agree with King. They thought that he should only speak for black people. Why should he speak for poor white people? Poor whites had their own leaders. But King had decided what he wanted to do. He planned to lead a poor people's march on Washington. And now everyone in America was thinking about a new problem: Vietnam. All through the 1960s, America was at war in Vietnam. Every year, more and more American soldiers were sent to fight in Vietnam. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were fighting there. Many of these soldiers were black and came from poor families. In the end, more than 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam. Vietnam was a terrible war. More than 2 million soldiers from North and South Vietnam were killed. More than 2 million Vietnamese who were not soldiers were killed or hurt. Thousands of villages were destroyed and rice fields were burned. Many Americans were against the war. They thought it was wrong for America to go to war with a small country like Vietnam. King agreed with them. He was worried about what his country was doing. He decided to speak out against the war. Some of his friends told him not to do this. They said the war was not his business. He should only talk about the problems of black people. But on the 4th of April, 1967, King made an important speech about Vietnam. He said he could not be silent about the war anymore. People had said that he should not speak about peace. He should only speak about civil rights. "These people," King said, "do not know me. They do not know the world in which they live." Then he attacked the U.S. government. He said the war on Vietnam was wrong. The burning and the bombing had to stop. The killing of Vietnamese men, women, and children had to stop. "I speak as a child of God and as a brother to the poor. I speak as an American. The Vietnamese, too, are my brothers and sisters. The American government must stop its violence against the Vietnamese people. War is not the answer. Martin Luther King was attacked for this speech. What did he know about Vietnam? Some newspapers said he was supporting the Vietnamese government when American soldiers were fighting and dying. But protests against the war grew. All over America, protesters fought with the police. University students who refused to join the army and fight in Vietnam rioted. At Kent State University, Ohio, 4 white students were shot dead by the National Guard. "Now we know what it feels like to be black," said one white student. Chapter 13. Death in Memphis. Many people who wanted to change America began to ask questions about Martin Luther King's policy of nonviolence. Was it possible to change things in America peacefully? The Black Panthers and the followers of Malcolm X did not think so. They thought that the only answer to white violence was black violence. One young black leader, H. Rap Brown, said that violence was as American as apple pie. More and more young blacks agreed with him. There were riots in the black neighborhoods of cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Young blacks joined gangs to protect their neighborhoods from the police and from gangs in other parts of the city. Gangs fought against each other. Guns were used, and many young black men were killed. These killings made King very sad. He hated to see young black men killing each other. He understood why young blacks were angry, but he still thought that violence was not the answer. He tried to persuade young blacks to stop fighting each other, and instead start fighting the government that kept them in poverty. But few young people wanted to listen to him. They thought that Martin Luther King did not understand them. To them, he was yesterday's man. He belonged to the past. In 1968, King was tired. Speeches, marches, and protests had been his life for more than 12 years. He had won many battles. Black people were freer than they had been when he began his fight for civil rights. But he knew that there were many more battles to fight. Blacks were still poorer and less successful at school than whites. There were few blacks in important jobs. Young black people did not remember the battles King had won. They wanted more change, and they wanted it now. In March 1968, a group of workers in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, decided to stop work because they were badly paid. Most of these men were black, and they worked hard to keep the city clean. They asked Martin Luther King to help them with their protest. King agreed to march with them. The marchers wanted to protest peacefully, and they sang and held hands. But gangs of young blacks did not want to protest peacefully. They attacked the march, broke shop windows, and fought with the police. A young man was killed in the fighting. After the march, King talked to the gangs. He explained what he was trying to do. He said that violence was not the answer. They needed to hold a peaceful protest. That was the only way that the workers could win. Some of the young men from the gangs argued with King. They said that times had changed and that peaceful protests did not work anymore. Finally, King persuaded them to join him. the gangs agreed to join the workers on their next march. They promised not to use violence. The date for the next march was the 5th of April. On the 3rd of April, King came back to Memphis and made a speech. It was full of hope. "I have been to the mountaintop," he said. "I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land." On the next day, the 4th of April, King told his friends that he needed some air. He went out of his hotel room just after 6 o'clock in the evening. Suddenly, there was the sound of a gun. His friends ran outside and found King lying on the ground. Someone had shot him. Jesse Jackson, one of King's young supporters, held him in his arms. An hour later, Martin Luther King died in a Memphis hospital. He was 39 years old. Chapter 14. Still Dreaming. Martin Luther King's death shocked America. Black Americans could not believe that they had lost their leader. At first, they were shocked, but soon they were angry. "Go home and get your guns," the Black Power leader, Stokely Carmichael, told a crowd in Washington, D.C. There were riots in all the big cities in the USA. The rioters fought the police. 46 blacks were killed in the riots that followed Dr. King's death. James Earl Ray, a white American, was arrested and went to prison for King's murder. But many people did not believe that Ray had acted alone. They thought that white politicians had paid him to kill King. Even Coretta King did not believe that Ray had killed her husband. Martin Luther King's body lay in his father's church in Atlanta. Thousands of people came to say goodbye to the man who led the fight for civil rights. Later, King's body was taken to lie beside his grandparents. There, written on a stone, are the last words of his most famous speech. "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." After his death, many people wanted to remember Martin Luther King in some way. In 1980, Stevie Wonder wrote a song called Happy Birthday. The song said that King's birthday should be a holiday for all of the United States. In 1983, a new law named the third Monday in January Martin Luther King Day, a new American holiday. On the 20th of January, 1986, the first Martin Luther King Day, Stevie Wonder sang at a concert to give thanks for King's life. In the year 2000, all 50 states had a holiday on this day for the first time. What happened to the other people in the Martin Luther King story? Jesse Jackson, who was with King when he was killed, stood for election as President of the United States in 1984 and 1988. Later, he worked for President Clinton, and he has visited many countries to work for peace. Bobby Seale still works for civil rights, but does not believe in guns and violence anymore. Malcolm X was shot dead in February 1965 as he was giving a speech at a meeting. Huey Newton came out of prison in 1970 and went to live in Cuba. When he returned from Cuba, he left the Black Panthers after some trouble over money. He was shot dead in 1989 in a gunfight over drugs. James Earl Ray was sent to prison for 99 years. He died in Nashville in 1998 at the age of 70, still protesting that he had not killed Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks left Montgomery and moved to Detroit. She continued working for civil rights. In 1990, she met Nelson Mandela just after he left prison. And Mandela said that he often thought about her brave action while he was in prison. She was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998. She died on the 25th of October, 2005, aged 93. Coretta Scott King began the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, to continue her husband's work. For the rest of her life, she worked for peace and civil rights. She died on the 31st of January, 2006. 4 U.S. presidents went to her funeral: George W. Bush, his father, George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton. Now, Dexter Scott King, son of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, manages the King Center. Martin Luther King's body was moved to the King Center, and now Coretta's body is there beside his. And Martin Luther King? What can we say about him today, more than 40 years since his death? Has his dream of a fair and equal America come true? There are more Black Americans in important, powerful jobs than ever before. More than 300 American cities are governed by Black leaders. On television, there are many Black reporters and newsreaders. In 2001, Colin Powell became the first African-American Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. In 2005, Condoleezza Rice was chosen for the same job. At a meeting in African American History Month, she talked about what Martin Luther King's ideas meant to her. Black Americans, African Americans, have always believed in America, even in the darkest times. They believed in America when America didn't believe in them. Martin Luther King told America that it should be true to itself. And finally, America did the right thing by African Americans. But only 59% of Black Americans are registered to vote. And the Black vote is important, most of all when America votes for its president. In the presidential election of 2004, when George Bush beat John Kerry, more than 90% of African Americans voted for Kerry. Martin Luther King's dream has not yet come true. Blacks and whites are not yet equal. Look at the young Americans who go to prison, cannot find a job, or die in street violence. For every white person who finds himself in this group, there are 5 blacks. Being Black in America is like wearing shoes that don't fit, an African-American writer has said. You can get used to them, but they're not comfortable. That's the way it's always been. It's the way it always will be. The fight for civil rights in America has had many leaders. It has also had other people who worked quietly for that fight. Many of those people were not well known at the time, and nobody remembers them now. But for more than 10 years, Martin Luther King was the voice of those people. He was a great speaker whose words could persuade people. During the bus boycott in Montgomery, one of King's followers said, "Dr. King, you have the words that we're thinking but can't say." And that is why we still remember Martin Luther King today.